Welcome to the theAnalysis.news podcast. I'm Paul J. Don't forget, there's a donate button at the top of the page. And without viewers' support, we can't do this. In 2019, Canada finally signed the Arms Trade Treaty, known as the ATT, becoming the 104th state to do so. So that means 103 states did it before Canada did. And Canada was actually the last NATO country to do so. The treaty is supposed to regulate the sale of what's called small arms, but it includes some pretty big arms, anything from battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, attack helicopters, to missiles and missile launchers. Canada was the world's 16th largest arms exporter between 2014 and 2018, and is now in the top 15. With a $15 billion sale of light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia, Canada became the second largest exporter of arms to the Middle East. Those vehicles will be used in the Saudi war in Yemen and against its own people. The real size of Canada's exports are hard to measure, as the majority are to the United States and do not require the same export controls. But when the U.S. wages an illegal war, you can be sure Canadian manufactured arms and parts will be there. Canada's contribution to the global war machine is a growing business. And in spite of the rhetoric about Canada being the righteous peacekeeper, the Canadian government promotes arms sales as if it were wheat or timber. Now joining us is Yves Engler. He's a Montreal-based activist, an author, a journalist. He's published 11 books, including his latest, House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy. Thanks for joining us, Yves.
Thanks for having me.
So, Yves, why don't we start with what that ATT treaty was about? When it says regulate these arms sales, what does it mean? Because there's this massive sale to the Saudis, $15 billion over a few years. And whatever that whatever the ATT treaty was, it didn't seem to have put any brakes on that.
No, it didn't. It's supposed to regulate weapons from being used in conflicts, in human rights abuses. But obviously, if Canada can still be signing giving out new permits for weapons to the Saudis, while the Saudis are involved in the probably one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the world, i.e. waging a brutal war in Yemen, then obviously the Arms Trade Treaty is not that serious. And it should be noted that the permits for the light armored vehicle sale, the $14 billion light armored vehicle sale, the biggest export of Canadian weapons ever, actually biggest single export contract in Canadian history. That's a permit that's was signed, and the process of delivering those weapons began before Canada signed the International Arms Trade Treaty. But they have begun new export permits of weapons to the Saudis. Those include rifles, Canadian-made rifles that have appeared in Yemen, and other arms. So no, the Arms Trade Treaty is it sort of sounds good in theory, but just like Canada had on paper, it had arms, had restrictions previous to signing the Arms Trade Treaty, with its own legislation, and there was always ways of bypassing that legislation.
So you wrote an article recently about the role of the Canadian government in promoting these sales, and that's a lot to do with what the Canadian government does. I mean, if you visit one of the embassies kind of anywhere in the world, they're all about facilitating the sale of products to whatever country the embassy is in. So why shouldn't the government be promoting arms sales, is what people would say. It's part of the economy. It's an export. So why shouldn't the Canadian government do this?
Well, I think the first thing is I don't think most Canadians perceive as much of or most of what embassies do is advance Canadian corporate interests. That's not what most people perceive embassies doing. It's that they deal with diplomatic issues, visas, and stuff like that. But you're right. In fact, most of what they do is advance Canadian corporate interests. And in case of arms sales, I mean, one of the things defense attaches do, and there's about 30 plus Canadian defense attaches at embassies, high commissions around the world, part of their explicit job is to advance Canadian arms exports. Now, I think the reason why the Canadian government shouldn't be promoting arms sales is fairly self-explanatory in that, these are used to kill people, and that I think most people consider that to be a bad thing. Now, in some contexts, obviously, there's varying degrees of who you're selling weapons to and the likelihood of those weapons to be used in conflict. But the Canadian government, when it comes to allied nations, its willingness to sell weapons to basically anybody, i.e., if you're willing to sell weapons to the Saudis, both with regards to Yemen and with regards to domestic repression, you're pretty much willing to sell arms to any geopolitical ally. Now, the Canadian government doesn't promote arms sales to China or Russia or Venezuela, countries that are viewed as geopolitical competitors. So it's not a promotion of arms sales no matter what. It's a promotion of arms sales no matter what to countries that are viewed as aligned with Washington. But again, I think that most Canadians would be made uncomfortable to understand the scope to which the Canadian government, the Canadian military spend taxpayer dollars, take time, effort to promote arms exports, including to clear human rights abusing militaries.
I guess it's the hypocrisy of Canada trying to portray itself as like one of the main peacekeepers in the world, one of the main blue helmet countries, and making so much money out of war. The hypocrisy is something. But the other part of it is how much Canada sells to the United States, and it's a little murky, is it, or is it a little? Has the treaty made it any clearer what the size of those sales are and where the Canadian arms and parts are going when they sell to the United States?
It's very murky. I mean, the going back more than half a century through the Defense Production Sharing Agreement, basically the Canadian arms industrial base is viewed as it's an integrated North American market. And so the Canadian government doesn't even give data on arms exports to the U.S. So we don't know. We know it's billions of dollars. I think usually it's viewed as somewhere between more than half of all of Canada's global arms exports go to the U.S. And last year, almost $4 billion in non-U.S. arms exports. So that would put it at around another $4 billion to the U.S. But we don't really know. It's when Canada provides military equipment to the U.S. that is then passed on to other countries. There is supposed to be Canadian okay for that. That generally doesn't happen. And there's all kinds of different components of weapon systems that are produced in Canada. Canada is not generally a producer of full weapon systems, but Canadian companies provide all kinds of high tech components to broader U.S. weapon systems that are used by the American military and then also exported to many different countries.
This thing about selling to the U.S. and then you don't know what the U.S. does with them. The same thing must go with Saudi Arabia. So much of what Saudis bought on the global arms market, I don't know specifically about Canada, wound up in Syria. And the Saudis are clearly arming what I don't know the term one wants to use, Islamic militants or ISIS types, even Al-Qaeda types. Saudi's been passing arms through to a lot of these kinds of forces. I assume there's no restriction on the Saudis once they take delivery of Canadian arms where they're going to end up.
No, there's no restriction. I'm personally not familiar about weapons in Syria. I think it's very likely that Canadian weapons appeared in Syria via Saudi Arabia, via UAE. We have absolute uncontroversial video, photographic evidence of Yemen, sniper rifles, multiple different Canadian companies, light armored vehicles in Yemen. There was also Canadian light armored vehicles used when the Saudis invaded Bahrain in 2011 to help suppress the pro-democracy movement there. Once the weapons are in the hands of the Saudi military, and we also know the Saudis used Canadian weaponry when they suppressed Shia movements in the east of Saudi Arabia a handful of years ago. Once it's in the hands of the Saudi military and or U.S. military or the Israeli military, for that matter, the Canadian it's not clear, and the Canadian government is not interested in trying to figure out where the weapons are used. Certainly, if it portrays those weapon sales in a negative light.
Do we know whether Canada produces any parts or is part of the production of nuclear weapons in the United States?
I don't know about today. I mean, historically, obviously, with the two nuclear bombs that were dropped on Japan, Canada was right at alongside Britain. It was the third player in the Manhattan Project, and in supporting that uranium. You had the Canadian minister. C.D. Howe, who boasted about the important role Canada played in the production of nuclear weapons after the Americans dropped them in Japan 75 years ago. Up until today, I don't think there is significant Canadian involvement in U.S. nuclear weapons, but there's a long history of Canadian uranium being used in U.S. nuclear weapons.
And do we know whether uranium is still being used in U.S. weapons?
I don't think it is, but I'm not exactly sure. I know there was reports back when in the first Iraq War that there was depleted uranium used in Iraq by the Americans, and there was reports that some of that was coming from Canada. But I'm not sure if that's still the case.
There's a story about a kind of turning point in Canadian-U.S. relations, particularly when it comes to the military and what they call operational. What's the term when they have cross-operational
interoperability?
Interoperability and such. And that was in the early 60s. I think it was 62 or 63. Kennedy wanted to put Bomark nuclear tipped missiles in Canada as part of the radar, as part of a radar system called SAGE, where supposedly this radar system was going to detect Soviet bombers coming in, and then the computer system would be able to direct nuclear tipped Bomark missiles at the Soviet bombers. The whole thing was actually a fraud. And if people are interested, I'll run this again. I did an interview with Lester Ernest, who worked for the SAGE radar system. And in fact, they had never worked out how to deal with radar jamming. And so the whole thing was $1 trillion schmozzle just to get money out of the Pentagon, because this is done through MIT. But the key thing was Diefenbaker, when Kennedy said he wanted Bomark missiles put in Canada, said no. And the election, I believe it was 62, 63, was one of the major issues in the election was Diefenbaker saying no Bomarks. And this was the election where Lester Pearson actually won eventually, and Pearson was in favor of Bomark missiles. And it turned out that Kennedy had actually sent pollster Lou Harris up to Ottawa with a fake name and a fake passport to help Pearson with very modern polling methods and messaging, and in fact help Pearson win. In fact, Ron Haggard used to be a friend of mine. I mean, he was a friend of mine. He passed away. He was covering Ottawa at that time for, I guess, the Toronto Star. He said it was a well-known fact, or in some ways a joke, that Pearson's election campaign was being run out of the basement of the U.S. Embassy. So Kennedy actually helped bring down the Diefenbaker government in order to impose Bomark missiles, even at a time, because by the time they put the Bomarks in Canada, they were obsolete. Because by that time, there were enough ICBMs that if there ever was a war, Soviets wouldn't have used bombers anyway. But I think that's a critical moment in where Diefenbaker, that still had one foot in with the British and didn't want to have such complete subservience to the U.S. military complex, was defeated. And then Canada becomes a real full-fledged partner in the American industrial military complex. How important is that partnership? We know it's half of the export sales, but in terms of interoperability, in terms of exports of arms, how important is it to Canada, and what does it mean for Canadian sovereignty?
Well, I mean, I think that the military partnership between the Canadian military and the U.S. military, you can't overplay the extent of interrelations. Some stat a few years ago, there was 80 different formal agreements, about 250 other working arrangements between the Canadian military and the American military. There's NORAD is the most famous one, where the U.S. Generals and can direct Canadian-based airplanes in case of theoretical Russian invasion, and then a Canadian who's second in command. If the American is sick or out of place, he can be in charge of U.S. capabilities. So I've joked previously that if the U.S. was to invade Canada, there would be Canadians through the NORAD system that would be enabling the U.S. invasion of Canada, just like there are Canadians through the NORAD that help the U.S. invasion of Iraq, about bombing of Afghanistan, and anywhere where the U.S. is bombing, they're enabling that through NORAD command. So there is it's an incredibly integrated military relationship. If you look at the history of the generals, the recent chiefs of the defense staff of the Canadian military, they all have been trained in the U.S. and have at different points been in charge of thousands of U.S. troops. Walter Natizink, the chief of defense staff for early 2010s, he was in charge of 35,000 foreign troops in Iraq during U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. So if you look at
the Canadians generals played an important role in Libya too, didn't they?
Yeah, that was formerly under as a Canadian. It was a Canadian that was commanded the whole NATO bombing of Libya. That was officially as a Canadian, but Walter Natizink did it. Canada was technically not supposed to be involved in the war in Iraq and the invasion and war in Iraq. So the relationship between the Canadian military and American military is, people have noted repeatedly that Canadian top generals and officials, they are more concerned about their relationship to their American counterparts than they are to their political masters in Ottawa. That is said over and over again. And I think that's sometimes there's some element of a left nationalist thing that kind of can sometimes exaggerate some of that thing, but I think it is very real in terms of the relationship, and I think for good reason from the Canadian military's perspective. The American military treats the Canadian military better than any other country's military. They are they're basically treated as if they are Americans, and they're get to be in charge of all kinds of fancy weapon systems and stuff they couldn't possibly imagine being in charge of if they just were in Canada, and they get to be dispatched in different countries. Again, they get more action, if you like. And so that's something that's really significant. And then the whole military industrial base in this country, the Defense Production Sharing Agreement, where basically it's a really good deal for Canadian weapons companies to be able to contract to the Pentagon, and that was designed back in the 50s. That was designed in part to bring the whole Canadian military industry and industry more generally into being tied into the U.S. for political purposes of aligning Canada with the U.S. empire, and that was stated pretty explicitly by the American officials at the time. So yeah, I think that in the case of Diefenbaker and Pearson, you're exactly right. Was Diefenbaker was a little bit slow in understanding the shift that was going on within Canada towards being completely aligned with the U.S. empire from the historic alignment with the British, and Pearson represents really the complete break, where it's unequivocal that Canada is primarily aligned with the U.S. empire, and I think that I think I'm a little cautious with some left nationalist Canadian explanations of this, of framing it just simply as Canada being deferent to the U.S. I view it as the Canadian military companies have done very well by this relationship, and so they see it as very much serving their interests.
And I think it's a combination of things, but the growing intertwining of the Canadian and U.S. economy, which certainly begins at the beginning early in the 20th century, but reaches a real culmination. That Pearson-Diefenbaker election, I think, was a reflection that the preponderance of the economy had really become American by 1960-61. In fact, it really kind of had earlier, but it hadn't played itself out all through the politics yet. But since that time, the importance of the U.S. market for Canadian exports is just completely taken over the Canadian economy, and especially now since NAFTA and free trade, the Canadian economy couldn't survive, at least as it is, without this exports. And I interviewed General Louis Mackenzie in 2004, and I talked to him about the Iraq War and the Afghan War, and I said, why did we send troops to Afghanistan? And his answer was because we didn't send them to Iraq. And now I know we did kind of, but not in the kind of numbers and with the kind of commitment that the Americans wanted. I know there was a Canadian involvement, but it was minor compared to what Bush wanted. And Mackenzie told me that we had to do Afghanistan in a big way, and the quote from him was, because we had to pay in blood if we wanted to keep the border open for Canadian exports. Now, I don't know if he was a little bit exaggerating or not, in the sense I'm not so sure Bush would have closed the border, but frankly, you can imagine a Trump type actually might. And so the argument you would get from the Canadian government, I guess, and such, is that that's the way it is. The Canadian economy is completely subservient and needing the American market. And so we have to play along when it comes to the military machine and foreign policy machine. And they don't think another world is possible.
I mean, I agree with big chunks of that, but I think that if you look at the Mexican economy, right, the Mexican economy is even greater exports. And take a really concrete example. So Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei, it was the Canadians that arrested her. She was en route to Mexico. Mexican officials have already gone on record saying there's no way they would have arrested her on behalf of the Trump administration if she would have arrived in Mexico City. She'd been in 12 different countries before arriving in Canada. Mexico didn't go into Afghanistan. Right, the Mexican military is not as integrated, Mexican foreign policy is not as integrated into U.S. foreign policy. So I agree that there is the U.S. has all kinds of leverage in terms of economic relationship and a fear in the Canadians and Canadian business class about closing the border. But I think there's something much more. There's another element to it, which is I think a mix of everything from white supremacy to linguistic commonality to the fact that the Canadian capitalists are totally integrated with American capitalists. That and that's been the case for more than a century. Where when the Americans invaded Cuba, it was Canadian banks that were the primary beneficiaries that did all the banking for the U.S. occupation of Cuba in the early 1900s. So Canada's role in the Five Eyes intelligence agency, right? It's the Canadian military, the Communications Security Establishment, which is an arm of the Canadian military that's part of the Five Eyes with the U.S., Britain, New Zealand, Australia. That's really pushing the conflict with China today. And that's rooted in colonialism that's rooted in British Empire. There's a linguistic component to it, though the linguistic components, even if you get into that, Nigeria is more English speakers in Nigeria or in India than there are in New Zealand or Australia. So I think there's relationships that are tied to Canada just being at the core of empire, and we're And I really genuinely believe that when American military commander sees another Canadian general, they see themselves, and there's all kinds of things behind that. And I think so. So I see it as the Canadian elite view the world and profit from the world in a very similar way to the U.S. elite. Yes, there are instances clearly where the U.S. pressures. I mean, the George W. Bush's ambassador to Ottawa, I'm forgetting his name right now, he said that he had one directive, which was to increase Canadian military spending. That was the single directive. Donald Trump has sent letters to Trudeau calling for an increase in military spending. So the U.S. views expanding the Canadian military is really just expanding their military and expanding the Canadian, the American empire. So I think that there are instances where there is pressure. Increasing military spending is a clear example, but I think that there's a really a commonality of interest among the Canadian ruling class and the American ruling class that's quite unprecedented.
Yeah, I think that's really important what you're saying. They like the argument that Louis Mackenzie gives, as if Canada's pressured or forced into doing these terrible things. And there may be some truth to that, but the bigger story is that Canadian companies and the corporate elite, and particularly the Canadian banks, they only care about sovereignty when it makes them money to care about sovereignty. So Canadian broadcasting is a really good example of it. For a long time, the Canadian broadcasters defended the Canadian market and didn't want any lessening of restriction on American channels coming up here. They wanted simulcasting of ads to protect their advertising market. But as some of the private monopolies or big broadcasters Canadians got really big and became pretty big pools of capital themselves, what they really then wanted was to get into the U.S. market, where there was more money to be made. And so then they didn't mind all kinds of liberalization and lessening the restrictions on on U.S. channels in Canada and such. And they didn't mind the opening up because they wanted to go down there. Same thing with banking. The longest time they really protected banking, and they still do to a large extent. But when TD bought a big bank in the U.S. and the Canadian banks became real players, then they weren't so concerned about sovereignty anymore. And the issue for them is that sovereignty and the defense of the Canadian border was for a time necessary for the Canadian elite to get on its own legs and become big enough to compete on a global stage. But once they were big enough, then the sovereignty became less and less an issue for them. And that's kind of where they are now. And it's kind of a nice game the Canadians get to play, which is you can ride the sort of gravy train of global plunder that the United States is able to carry out and cash in on that, but still look so pretty and nice to the rest of the world. Although, as we discussed in the last interview we did, maybe not so nice anymore because they couldn't get voted onto the UN Security Council. So maybe a lot of the world seeing through the veneer of that. Right now, if you look at what's going on in the United States, there's a very, very aggressive approach being taken to China. And it's not just Trump. You're seeing it in Biden's rhetoric as well. And while some of that might be tactical, that he doesn't want Trump to outflank him on the China rhetoric, and if anything, he's may try to outflank Trump from the right on China. Biden's policies actually are very confrontational with China, and maybe not so much as Trump is talking about. Steve Bannon's in Trump's ear, and he talks about actually encouraging conflict in the South China Sea. And there's a lot of voices now about a big declaration of defense of Taiwan if China ever tries to use any military force in Taiwan, because right now it's supposedly ambiguous. Canada was the country that, in alliance with the United States, really, but still, spearheaded the kind of opening of relationships between the United States and China. Where is Canada now? You talked about the arrest of Hue and that woman. Is Canada distancing itself at all from this anti-China fervor that's happening in the United States?
Well, I mean, just yesterday was the 50th anniversary commemoration of Canada's diplomatic relations with China. And Justin Trudeau, who has been viewed as, is widely criticized for being sort of pro-China by much of the establishment. He's been close to people like the Desmarais family that are Power Corporation, which is billionaire family who have long-standing business relations with China going back 40 years, and so he's been viewed as sort of close to I guess kind of pro-China, if you want to call it that. But his speech yesterday on the 50th anniversary was considered this big step towards we're getting tough on China and criticism of China. Now, I mentioned the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the head of Huawei, and which is this Chinese multinational 5G cutting edge telecommunications company. And basically, the Americans are trying to stunt this rise of one of China's first really successful global high-tech firms, and her arrest was done at the behest of the U.S. and it's supposedly because she her company had relations with Iran and violated American sanctions against Iran, or misled a bank about violating American sanctions against Iran. Canada frames their arrest of Meng Wanzhou and the deporting her, or extraditing her, should I say, as following the rules-based order or following the law, but in fact, U.S. sanctions on Iran contravene international law, so you're upholding American violation of international law. But so Canada's, I think, the Trudeau government is split. The military sector of the Canadian establishment very much wants to go conflict with China. Right now, Canada is a Canadian naval vessel that's part of those so-called freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, and that are viewed as hostile by China, and alongside American naval vessels. Just one a couple of days ago that got a bit of a media attention. That's been going on at a low level for a number of years. So the security state, the communications security establishment, the Canadian military, CSIS, the intelligence agency, they clearly want a more conflictual relationship with China. There are elements of the Canadian corporate class that see China as a big market and want better relations with China, but the thrust of the direction is going towards conflict with China. And when you start getting into it, I mean, there's Canadian troops in Korea. Still, there's a small number of Canadian troops. Since the Korean War in the early 1950s, that was a war fought against China in large part. And Canadian troops continue to be there alongside, 30,000 or so American troops. Canada, trying to set up a naval base or small military hub in Singapore, partly tied to conflict with China, or keeping an eye on China. So there's this whole it's in the Canadian political discussion. It's sort of the whole element of the history of aggression towards China is just kind of like wiped out. And yes, China is now a powerful country, and it's full of billionaires. I don't think it's a country that progressive-minded people should look up to as some beacon of where we want to go. Lots of repression, but China has, risen out of being, dominated imperially for, more than a century, and the ways in which Canada, contributed to that, refused to recognize China for more than 20 years, right? It recognized, the government in Taiwan for more than 20 years. So there's this whole history that's sort of left out of the discussion. And quite frankly, a lot of this is, I consider just incredibly dangerous. I mean, you want to get into another Cold War with China? Do you want to, actually turn into a hot war and have a conflict that just seems like, craziness? It's also just drives us away from dealing with the pandemic, climate crisis, all these things that necessitate, global cooperation. But there's this whole push from the security, military elements of Canadian political life, which are, very well integrated with the U.S. security and military that are, pushing in that direction.
Yeah, you would think it would be in Canada's broader interest to actually not jump on board the American approach to China, to use China to give some separation, because if you're in the same situation again where Trump threatens, or someone like a Trump threatens Canada, as Trump did in terms of adding tariffs on goods and so on, the only serious alternative market is China. China's a hell of a lot bigger market than the United States anyway. And if you want to create some sovereignty, some separation, you don't want to be seen by China as what's the old word, a running dog, a lackey, which Canadians are starting to look like.
And the Trudeau government was trying to sign, early on, they wanted to sign a free trade agreement with China. And then in the renegotiated NAFTA, there's a clause that basically has the Americans have to okay any trade agreement with I forget the exact wording, but a non-market country, which is widely viewed as China. So the U.S. essentially has the ability to nix a Canada-China free trade accord. And it's, I find that very difficult to view, like a free trade agreement with China as something progressive, because I think the whole model of these trade agreements is something that empowers corporations. But compared to, going towards, a new Cold War or more conflict with China, the, alternative sort of like capitalistic pro-corporate kind of direction is preferable than the more militaristic, xenophobic direction that we're going in.
And I think Canadians had better get the importance of this, because it's not just an abstraction, and it's not just about selling arms to the Saudis or, going along with some terrible thing the Americans do. If there's a real fascization, I should say there already is a real fascization, a process of fascization in the United States. But if not this election, but maybe 2024, if Biden continues the economic policies of the Obama administration, and the wealth gap and inequality grows so much as it did under Obama, and we are in a deep depression, we are getting into a deeper depression, we're into a second wave of the pandemic, there may be a third wave of pandemic. By 2024, it's not inconceivable at all that the Republicans come back either with Trump again, because I don't see why he can't run again if he only served one term. You're not allowed to serve two terms, but I don't think there's anything that stops you from running for a second term. Or if not a Trump, someone more coherent. I was saying in another interview that, Trump may be the buffoon tip of a more coherent fascist spear. And if you start to get a really overtly authoritarian government in the United States, well, I don't think it's going to be like Handmaid's Tale, where Canada's a refuge, or there's this other show that's on TV called The Plot Against America, which is based on a Philip Roth novel, where Lindbergh won the election in 1940, and you get a fascist United States. And again, Canada's a refuge. If you really get that kind of authoritarian, quasi-fascist government in the United States, given the subservience of the Canadian government, Canadian state to the Americans, the integration of the Canadian military with the U.S. military and such. I don't know how likely it is Canada's going to be this great refuge of democracy and human rights and so on, while the United States is increasingly fascist. We better start thinking about this stuff now, not later, because this is all getting very real.
Yeah, I mean, the founder of the Proud Boys is a Canadian, right? You know, the Proud Boys that was cited by Trump were brought up at the debate, and so those currents are, the integration between the far right elements in the U.S. and in Canada are take place at the more sort of radical end of the right. But then also, if you look at the rhetoric of the conservatives, the new leader of the Conservative Party, he really has taken up the China campaign, and that's just totally echoing Trump. There's some ways in which he try to stay a little bit of distance with Trump, but a recent poll showed it's quite a significant proportion of the Conservative Party voters who are sympathetic to Trump. Right, so the Conservative Party could be could win the next election and could be the governing party in Canada. So, I think there is still a distance. I think the border still matters. I think Quebec plays a role in tampering some of that in Canadian politics still, but those, I think you're right that those dynamics are real, and when you see Justin Trudeau just unable to criticize Donald Trump around when he's openly supporting white supremacists or sending troops in to clear out Black Lives Matters protesters. When Trudeau's unable to do that, you just see how much of the Canadian elite are unwilling to challenge, and how that enables that process within Canadian political life.
Yeah, I think it's very important. The other show, although it's a great show, Man in the High Castle on Prime, but the same kind of story. Fascism comes to the United States, and Canada supposedly is exempt from it. It's not going to happen like that. And I wear both hats. I'm a dual citizen. I lived in the U.S. for many years. Now I'm back in Canada. I'm putting my Canadian hat on. We Canadians had better get serious about this, because this political process in the United States and the parasitism of the financial sector and the forces for very far-right politics in the United States, and the complete failure of this supposed liberalism of the Democratic Party to address the serious concerns of working people, it's set the plate for I think, a more dangerous Trump coming in the future. And for Canadians to look sort of arrogantly or contemptuously or self-righteously, oh, look at us, we may have Ford as Premier of Ontario, but it ain't like what's going on in the U.S. Be careful about that, because I think if it's going to come to the U.S., there's no way Canada is going to be immune to this disease. Thanks for joining us, Yves.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on the theAnalysis.news podcast. And please, if you're listening on the podcast platforms, of which there are many, and I think we're on most of them, but I don't think there's any way to donate when you're listening on the podcast platforms. You got to come on over to theAnalysis.news and hit the donate button. Thanks for joining us.